I'm Eric Chemi, and this is Politely Pushy. Welcome to Politely Pushy. I'm your host, Eric Chemi. Today, my guest is Michelle Crozier. Michelle has been on the forefront of sustainability before that was even a word in corporations, corporate sustainability, before anyone had ever heard of ESG, for example. Michelle was there. Michelle's had some very interesting jobs working in Hollywood studios, working across the globe. So I want to get into all of that with you, Michelle. Thank you so much for joining me today here on the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me, Eric. I appreciate it.
And of course, anyone can go to your LinkedIn and see, look, hey, you worked for Time Warner, you worked for Adobe, you worked for ByteDance, obviously the parent of TikTok. So you've had some really interesting, I would say, behind door conversations, closed room conversations. What, talk about the beginning though, right? When you were doing sustainability, my guess is they weren't a lot of job listings for come be a sustainability officer at a big corporation.
There were not. I've been doing this for a long time, so I was rather early in the game, which did mean that I had to talk my way into jobs and having them create the position. So way back in high school, so more than 30 years ago now, I learned about this job even existing because a friend of our family became the first head of sustainability at Bank of America. And that was really early for a company to be looking at sort of environmental conservation principles. So luckily that family friend was kind enough to, mentor me. And when I eventually tried to get my first job in the industry at Time Warner, there was no job listing. I had basically just had to network and talk my way into getting them to create a position for me. And so I was the first person there to have what we then called corporate citizenship in the job title.
What part?
It's a different day now.
So what part of you, when you found out, we've got a family friend and they're doing sustainability or citizenship, I forget the word that you said at Bank of America, what part of you thought, wow, I want to do that too. That sounds exciting to me. I want to go work for a big company, but do something that feels almost more like a nonprofit type of function.
I had been thinking about working in environmental nonprofits as my career but this was back in high school, so I didn't have a super clear view. And just the revelation that I could work at a company, and my parents were kind of corporate people, and therefore have a much broader set of resources available than if you work at a nonprofit, was kind of when the light bulb went off that I could do this work at scale with the resources of a private company versus a nonprofit.
Okay. And then when you found, Time Warner started banging down their door, it's one thing to get a job, right? It's hard enough for people to get a job that's posted. It's another thing to say, I want you to make up a job and hire me. What was that process like?
Yeah, I was just really, really fortunate. So my first job in the field was at a nonprofit called the U.S. Green Building Council. And that was a membership organization where the members were all companies that were product manufacturers and real estate developers. And so I had a kind of a network of organizations that I knew prioritized sustainability in some manner. And so when it was, I was in business school getting my MBA because I felt like I needed that to help with my credibility to move from nonprofit to for-profit. So when I was graduating and looking at what companies to work at, I looked at the member list essentially, and those relationships that I had built for a couple of years working at the U.S. Green Building Council. And Time Warner, Disney, there were a lot of companies in the industry, in the entertainment industry on the list. So I reached out to the people who had been my points of contact in sustainability at the studios. And Disney was a little bit more advanced. They already had a team and people in my role, but Time Warner and Warner Brothers in particular didn't have anybody. So I just, got an introduction and kind of a reference from the founder of the USGBC, and was just really lucky that they took a chance. And then the next 10 years at Warner's were really like an extension of my MBA. Like it was sort of like a 10-year extension on a graduate degree with a focus on media and entertainment, because it was of course, a huge company at the time. It was AOL and cable and Time Inc. and all the content companies, Turner, HBO, Warner's, New Line, et cetera. And so it was a vast company to learn, which with each division having totally different set of CSR issues. So it was, yeah, I was just really lucky to have that opportunity.
And then what is the actual function of the job? Once you get there, okay, it's hard enough to get them to create the job, get them to hire you. Then what are you actually doing? Are you working with executives? Are you talking to movie producers, actors? So what is the actual job there?
Well, at the time, and this was like the early 2000s, CSR was still in its early stages. And so it was primarily focused on philanthropy, on employee engagement. And we hadn't yet moved into the more, I would say, progressive or regulated spaces. And so at the time, it was working with the actual studio production. So it's 100+ acre backlot with a lot of sustainability issues. If you think about, sets are built and torn down by design to be temporary, made out of wood and other materials that are, could easily be disposed or could be repurposed for Habitat for Humanity houses, which is what we eventually started doing. And craft services, it's a ton of food that doesn't get used unless you can, then package it and repurpose it for feeding, hungry individuals in the community. And elephant doors, the giant doors of sound stages are left open with air conditioning blowing and diesel generators on set and things. And so there were a lot of sustainability issues that we focused on initially within the operations of the studio. And then there were a lot of community commitments. And so this company by then was, it just celebrated 100 years. And so it was a mature company, and over the decades had built a lot of relationships in the Los Angeles community, but it had been kind of piecemeal. And so we needed to put together a philanthropic strategy with direct engagement with all of the executives, because this is a lot of it was relationship based, in order to make sure that we were contributing in sustained ways. And ultimately making the studio not like it's literally surrounded by walls, and so it looks like it and acts like a fortress, but we were in the middle of Burbank, a small suburban community, and we needed to do a lot to gain the trust of our neighbors and also provide jobs for them. And so that's the type of thing we were doing in the first decade there. But then, yeah, it evolved and got more integrated into the business as the field developed.
Right now, when you think about Hollywood studios, you think about words like sustainability, it feels like it's become so weaponized, right? It feels like you almost don't want to say it, right? You look at what happened with Larry Fink at BlackRock and how they're having to back away from some of the terminologies. Where do you think that changed? Were you noticing that in the early days, right? Those early 2000s days, or do you think that's just much more of a kind of a last 5 years type of phenomenon?
Yeah, I think that started in the late aughts and in the 20 teens. That was when CSR became the people like me started working with our investor relations team, and started working with a broader set of stakeholders other than communities and employees. That's when we were brought into board meetings to discuss supply chain, either labor or sustainability issues. That's when our shareholders, especially big institutional shareholders and activists like Carl Icahn, were asking questions that we didn't have the answers for, because we didn't have the data yet to understand how big our either impact was on certain issues, or like, for example, accessibility was a big issue. But what became the biggest issue that we worked with shareholders on was content. And when we started getting into conversations and research about how the content of what we produced actually had a potentially negative impact, for example, showing tobacco on screen or other risky behaviors, and how young people would actually respond to that, and potentially experimenting with addictive products or the like, we had a large group of stakeholders to be accountable to. So the national PTA or health groups, or many other advocates for certain issues that we knew that our content was having an impact on. And that's when the investors started to get in the conversations. That's when folks like Larry Fink and BlackRock and other large investors started setting expectations around ESG. So whereas it had previously been called corporate social responsibility or some variation thereof, environmental social governance added governance, which was generally beyond the scope of what CSR was doing, and therefore brought us more into the boardroom and into IR, and therefore finally making the function more strategic to the long-term business rather than more of a short-term focus on employee satisfaction and things like that.
How do you balance the arguments that companies should just try to make as much money as possible and, government can regulate, but, it gets weird when companies' job is to deliver this to shareholders and now they're doing all these other things that get in the way of profits. But you can make, then there's the other argument of companies need to be responsible stakeholders, like movie studios is a good example, or your role at ByteDance, things that can become addictive, right? Things that can become dangerous to mental health. But who should be the regulator, right? Like, I think we all agree there's certain bad things out there, but where do you draw the line on? You got to make as much money as possible we're trying to not destroy society and young people, for example. You are in the middle of this, I'm sure, every single day. What would be your prescription on what's the right balance and who should be the people responsible for it?
Well, I think, there is the argument that invisible hand that the market should take care of all of this and that companies shouldn't be doing these more proactive, potentially adjacent activities. But if you look at the full economic arguments around like an Adam Smith or something, he actually goes on to say that if your competitors are doing something though that is valuable to them or being perceived by customers or shareholders, you also need to do those things because it would be a competitive disadvantage not to. And so every studio was, or in every social media company, every tech company, whichever industry, I've always worked in tech and media and entertainment. This is obviously a very busy space. And so if a company is completely silent and inactive on these issues, they would very quickly be called out as a laggard. Whereas there's always an opportunity to be a leader instead. And so I think to your question about how do you, navigate what's important and what to take action on, it's so important to not just look at this as, a vertical corporate function that doesn't, that's separate from the products, from the operations, from the strategy. The most value that any CSR, ESG, pick your term, person can add is to deeply understand the business and the products or services that they're delivering and understand how they have an impact, whether upstream or downstream. Upstream if it's a manufacturing issue like semiconductors and the footprint and complications of mining and producing those, or the downstream like a TikTok or a studio that produces a lot of content, to understand the choices, whether it's how the algorithm works or what is the actual content that you're showing on screen and how viewers might respond to that or behave. And so you have to understand your specific niche and then take actions if there are any reasonable actions to mitigate. And the leaders will take it a step further and look for growth opportunities within those contexts. And so you may be missing entirely, a large chunk of the market, whether it's an age group or a demographic or a geography, if you're thinking narrowly about how your products are used. And so there's an opportunity to just be defensive, but then really even folks like Michael Porter from Harvard Business School advocate for this type of work to be the growth engine for companies, especially once they've exhausted the current typical markets.
How did it work in the reporting line, right? Because eventually everybody reports up to a CEO who reports to a board of directors who reports to shareholders. And some of the things that you're doing, let's say, can mean we're making less money or we're spending more money, but at some point it always reports back to the person who's responsible for making the most money. Were there conflicts that you had to navigate because, hey, here's what I'm being tasked to do, but maybe it means we lose on the bottom line in the short term, and that's somebody else's job to maximize that, and then there's the conflict.
Yeah. Well, ideally, when it comes to philanthropy specifically, it's a modest enough amount that it's not affecting the bottom line more than I don't want to. I was going to say a rounding error, but I think that a best practice is 1% of pre-tax profits. I think even that is overly generous, unless you have a really strategic program that you can show is having, near and long-term impact. So if say you're investing in STEM education to over the long term, provide a better pipeline for your industry, or a nearer term pipeline where you're reskilling individuals who can actually come into your company, maybe from an unexpected or underrepresented background, then you're actually moving the needle on D&I much more quickly than if you invest in a fifth grade STEM program. So it really depends on how effective your programs are. But if you think beyond philanthropy and the costs of implementing something like a net zero target, that will cost in many large companies over the course of 5 to 10 years, multiple billions of dollars. But if you look at it over the long term, those investments, there will be a return on that investment, longer horizon than a typical ROI for corporate capital, but not as long as you think. Maybe you're extending the ROI 3 years, and then you've got the most efficient data centers, or you've secured long-term renewable energy contracts, other things like that you're actually you are finding a return. So the larger the investment, generally the larger the return. So it's really more of the problem with the reporting lines is more of if you have a short-termism issue at the company. So of course, quarterly returns are everything, especially for public companies. And it can be really difficult to maintain your resources, even if you have, successfully advocated for them, if the share price takes a hit or something occurs. So it's important that you have ultimately, CEO level support, whether you report through the CFO. The general counsel is not an uncommon place to report because many companies are looking at this from a compliance lens more lately, due to updated regulations that are coming down the pike, making more of this work required rather than voluntary. And so whichever C-level you report to, it's just important that you're at the right tables and you're not just as a guest in certain C-level meetings, but that your C-level, or if you are a C-level, lately there have been more chief impact officers and chief sustainability officers, that it's not just a name and a new title that a company has created just for optics, but that you're actually at the table when resources and strategy are discussed, so that you can continue to educate the C-suite on the long-term value of all of this work.
I noticed on your LinkedIn profile that anyone can see, you use the phrase ESG, obviously, but you don't use DEI. But those two things have come in. There's just so much media craziness around I think the DEI phrase in particular. Do you see a difference between those two, functionally speaking, from the work point of view? And do you sort of bemoan the, combining of the two when it comes to a lot of the bad press out there right now?
Well, certainly DEI functions. DEI is under the umbrella of whether it's CSR or ESG, but because it usually lives in the HR organizations, and for the most part, CSR does not. Sometimes it does. Sometimes it reports to the chief people officer, but in more cases than not, it reports to either a communications or legal executive. And so DEI is always a part of what we do, mainly by supporting and partnering with the DEI colleagues in HR. What we've seen and at Adobe, you know, that we had a great example of that where we noticed there was a fewer, for example, Black and Hispanic technical workers at the company. And so we created Adobe Digital Academy in partnership with DEI, specifically to create a very near term, as in 6 month, you know, out pipeline of underrepresented individuals to become quickly trained up in tech and hired into these roles. And it was more successful ultimately in diversifying our technical workforce than even the diversity programs that are typically like university hiring initiatives. And so in that case, you know, we're sort of the fiscal sponsor of of innovative or, you know, experimental pilot programs that maybe HR organization doesn't have the bandwidth or the finances to support, but CSR can come in and provide the resources and the legwork and the relationships with, you know, educational institutions or whoever it may be to make programs like that, you know, to actually implement them successfully. But regarding like the weaponization of the terminology, I think we're definitely observing in the past few months that companies that made bold DEI commitments back in, you know, the 2000 timeframe, especially around Black Lives Matter, that those roles and those initiatives are to some extent being rolled back a little bit. And it's hard to understand if that's as a result of media kind of public sentiment on it or investor sentiment on it, or if it's just the cyclical nature of what we need to focus on in the very near term. And you know, we can chew gum, you know, and walk it at the same time. There's no reason, if the focus is on climate, for example, right now, the companies need to roll back any of their DEI initiatives. This is all of these things are necessary for a healthy society and a healthy planet. So I hope that it's just a blip. And I think that ESG, although in the US we're very cognizant of the negative, you know, kind of woke media discussions on this, that's not the case in other countries. In Europe, there has been no such, you know, backlash. It's really a US political issue right now. And so the intention is to ride it out, especially and continue to be bold and, you know, as CSR professionals to advocate for the role of business in society and advocating for that internally, because these are long-term solves and we can't be beholden to, you know, media cycles or political cycles when these are all, you know, decade-long problems to solve. So we just need to keep our heads, you know, we just need to focus on the long game here.
What was your experience like the last couple of years? ByteDance, TikTok, because that one in particular, you know, congressional hearings, so much, so you know, geopolitical, a lot of negative media there, and you're in the middle of that, and you know, a lot of people say, hey, it's super addictive, or they're spying on us, we should ban it, or the algorithm is more dangerous in America than the one in China. They're doing this on purpose, and it gets into stuff, you know, around wars and negative content there. And here you are saying, hey, I'm global head of ESG and CSR, and I'm trying to balance it. My guess is that there were a lot of headaches in the last couple of years for you.
Yeah, I would say being the first head of ESG and CSR, ByteDance is definitely my biggest professional challenge to date, because ByteDance, you know, it's a private company. And so there's limited information that's publicly available. So I can't even get into too much on the business, but any user of TikTok, which of course is just one of dozens of products, there are lots of other apps, and you know, there's VR hardware, there are there's a lot of games, there's a lot of enterprise software, there's a lot of AI, collectively with billions of daily active users. And TikTok is just the most well-known in the West. And so needing to get in and understand that large business, especially as a Chinese-owned company, was definitely a challenge doing, the first carbon footprint and the first ESG materiality assessment, and trying to then getting back to my point earlier to really understand the products and the opportunities, and any risk mitigation that needs to occur within those products. And I would say that trust and safety is a very large organization at ByteDance and at TikTok. So those individuals are on the front lines of content moderation and creating policies and partnerships to make sure that um, uh, harmful content does not appear on the platform, or if it appears, it's removed before anyone actually sees it. And they are very transparent about producing regular reports on what's allowed, the policies on what is allowed on the platform, how it's the decisions work to remove it, what's AI and what is human moderation. And the company invests heavily in those areas. And so the CSR team might be like 15 people, but the trust and safety team is literally tens of thousands of employees. And so the company really does an impressive job considering the volume of videos that are uploaded on TikTok, which are, let's just say the app's been downloaded more than 3 billion times, and the users are impressive. The user numbers are impressive. So they understand the weight of the responsibility, and there's a ton of great stuff. Like the media obviously likes to talk about the scary stuff, but it's democratizing, creativity and content distribution, and the e-commerce capabilities on TikTok Shop really are amazing. There are farmers in Southeast Asia that are selling their, produce online through TikTok Shop, 10x business increase just through local distribution. Like, it's not all viral, dance dance videos and
With
things
much more
like that.
commerce than just entertainment.
Yeah, there are more than 5 million businesses that have really kind of grown exponentially, small, medium-sized businesses in particular, through the marketing and free marketing and e-commerce on the app. So it does a lot more good than I think people can appreciate, because those stories don't make it to the media as much.
What would you say is the biggest misconception of TikTok here in America?
Look, I'm not in the public policy team, but the
Or
CEO,
from
of course,
talking
did.
to friends, or when you just say to people at
Yeah,
kids' school, like, hey, here's what I
well, that it's
do.
like a dance app. I'm
Yeah.
still amazed that people refer to it as like a dance app when, first of all, it's not even really considered by the company to be social media. It's an entertainment app. It's not about connecting with your friends and messaging and things like that. It's really about providing engaging and entertaining content. And obviously, anyone who has used it can appreciate the elegance of the UI and the sophistication of the algorithm. And so I would say it's downplaying the quality and the importance of the content, because a lot of people use it to, again, find connections with people who maybe they have a niche thing that they're managing in their lives that they really want to connect with other people with. It's a much more global platform than I think people appreciate. And yeah, anybody can. It's just the democratization of really important content. So I would just say it's not some silly dance app. It's a really valuable way to communicate.
And then, what do you see here? We are beginning of 2024. What do you see the next, let's say, 2 to 3 years as sort of medium-term outlook for corporate responsibility roles, sustainability roles, in terms of the kinds of people who will be doing it, their priorities, and more what do companies want to see happen differently going forward?
Well, a big trend that's happening is that in the past few years, the function is becoming much more regulated. So that
Wait, the
starts.
sustainability role is becoming regulated.
Well, not the roles themselves, but the work, the expectations externally. And so Europe is usually about 10 years ahead of the US on these issues, and they've already started regulating, carbon disclosures, carbon mitigation requirements. So first it starts with transparency across the topics of environmental, social, and governance. But now it's moving more. Even the US SEC has climate regulations that will come into play probably by next year. And so as these become, as the reporting and measurement and reporting requirements become real globally, this function is no longer a nice to have, or a marketing tool. It's going to be part of compliance and overall strategy to make sure that companies are making the best out of these additional requirements that are being that come to their businesses. And so I think the roles, therefore, will need to, the people who are doing the jobs, it'll certainly be, more legal teams. So more attorneys will need to be well versed in the different pieces of ESG, the DEI colleagues, because a lot of the social, the S of ESG, relate to diversity and inclusion, especially in the US. And it's just more broadly, the board of directors boards are now being sort of trained in this topic, so that and for example, the audit committee is qualified to review the data and disclosures that a company is making. So it's a much broader set of internal stakeholders that need to be familiar and well versed in this. And then the individuals themselves doing these roles, I mean, is the frameworks and the tools and the requirements are constantly changing. I mean, even on a kind of a weekly basis in some cases. And so it's a constant, just like any job, you have to stay on top of it. Maybe you need to go and become certified in carbon accounting, practices, or you need to go get, some certificate or qualification to just be at the forefront of this, so that you can be the internal expert at your organization, no matter what the issue is. And so I guess I would just say you need to continue to upskill and continue to be the person at your company who's really advocating for this work to be as integrated into the business as possible.
What do you think about you personally? As you've done a lot of tech and media, are you thinking about staying within tech and media, or are you thinking about branching out to a different industry where the problems might be, very different in scope?
Yeah, I mean, there are certainly no shortage of, there are industries like extractives, of course, and mining and things like that that are critical, and at the forefront of things around climate,
Truly environmental,
agriculture.
right? The E is like the true environmental part right
Yeah,
there.
I mean, go to the core and go work at ExxonMobil or something.
Right.
But I think, just to leverage the 20, plus years I have, I think that, I mean, yes, I'm based in Silicon Valley, so I probably have a bit of a bias around tech, but I think that the tech sector is just still incredibly important, due to both kind of the velocity and the continuing relevance it has. Obviously AI will have knock-on impacts on different aspects of ESG, whether that's through climate solutions or through labor, job market shifts. And so whether it's social media, AI, cybersecurity, semiconductors, all of these things are so relevant, and they're only going to continue, to be important. And this year, now that we're into 2024, there is obviously an election in the US, but there's an election in, I think, 78, a national election in 78 countries this year. And tech, in the different ways that technology, whether it's through security or through journalism and media and truth, finding, fact finding and verification, deep fakes, all of that, it's going to be incredibly important for each of these elections. And so long answer is that I think, staying in tech is compelling for the near future.
And then before we go, just because people listening will think, okay, hey, you worked in Hollywood. I need a Hollywood story, and you worked on certainly reducing tobacco and its usage. Just give us a story. Like, did you just go around to producers and say, hey, there's too much smoking in the show. You got to get this. You got to get the cigarettes out of here. What was the reality in terms of trying to get that accomplished? Because look, certainly whether it's then or now, there's just some awful stuff, content wise, right? In terms of drugs and sex and violence and things that you don't want your kids to see, let alone do. And it's, in the name of art, right? Or it's entertainment, or it's fiction, right? It's another fantasy, but you've got to go around and say, hey, let's try to make this better. Was that an easy conversation, or did it get a little awkward?
Yeah, I mean, there was no playbook when we started that work. It came to our attention when I was at Warner's that there was research from organizations like UCSF and Dartmouth that were showing a correlation between the depiction of tobacco on screen specifically and the decision of young people, teenagers in particular, of then experimenting with that addictive product and what the long-term impacts would be on their lives if that happened. And when you're operating at scale with billions of people seeing your content, then those numbers, start to really hit home. So luckily, we had the support of the president of the studio, who was just very progressive in this area, to take action and create what would now be considered content moderation, but back then we just kind of like, well, it's corporate, it's sort of content responsibility policies. We didn't even know what to call it. And, we're just, white page drafting what this could look like, how to maintain creative freedom whilst not, intentionally doing any negative harm. And I would say every part of Time Warner had a slightly different culture around that. So we made a lot of progress at Warner's, which was the largest content producer. So in a few years, 95% of our tobacco depictions were removed. At HBO, they insisted on a little bit more creative freedom. And they had characters like on Sex and the City that, they didn't think they were just going to all of a sudden quit smoking. But then we had networks like the WB, where we knew there were a lot of young people watching, and it was a broadcast network. So we came up with things like, well, there had to be negative consequences if risky behavior was shown. So that might be unprotected sex or drunk driving. And so we had a whole range of issues and guidance on how to manage it. And the president of the studio would have those conversations with like directors and A-list talent. Generally speaking, I was the literal corporate suit walking onto a soundstage.
They love
and
corporate suits. They love people like you. Yeah.
Black suit in Hollywood, and talking to the prop master. If I saw a pack of branded or even non-branded cigarettes, I would be like, this wasn't in the script, why is it there? And mind you, I'm not a creative. I don't have a film degree. So I recognize like the audacity of me walking onto a set and providing unsolicited feedback about props that were there. And if we needed to, we would go to the writers and directors. And sometimes that was on my plate. If the president didn't have the relationship or preferred to not have those conversations himself, I would, go and see, name your actor and director. And sometimes it was like, oh my God, I had no idea. Of course, I don't want to be causing any, harm. And then there were the others who were much more focused on, freedom and creative expression. And they were like, who in the world are you? Vice president corporate responsibility, you can't tell me what to do. And so I would just do my part and thank them for listening, but over time most of those issues got worked out. And so yeah, it was comical in that it was pretty ridiculous that you had kind of a corporate person coming to try to intervene when even the creative executives couldn't successfully give feedback. But luckily, I think obviously it wouldn't have happened if we didn't have the head of the studio, walking the talk in that respect.
I can't imagine some of the stories, and I'm sure there's a few NDAs and some things you can't say, but I appreciate at least you sharing a snippet of what that experience was like. I can only imagine from there, right? Here's the suit coming on the set, talking about our props or our scripts and all of that. I can only imagine. Michelle, thank you so much. Really fascinating conversation about where you started, where the industry is going, and what's been some of the journey along the way. Thank you so much for the time today.
I really appreciate it. Thanks, Eric.
Thank you to my guest, and thanks for listening. Subscribe to get the latest episodes each week, and we'll see you next time.